Ahoy everyone, and welcome to part 1 of my electric fan upgrade on my 91 Ford F-150. Currently I have my manual clutch fan on there, and I'm going to be replacing it with this electric fan that I picked up at the pick and pull. It is a 7-blade dual fan. Worked well when I plugged it up to the 12-volt battery that I have in the garage. Before I do that, I'm going to need to replace my thermostat. Currently, I have a colder 180-degree thermostat in the housing. I'm going to be replacing it with this 195-degree thermostat, which is OEM for this vehicle. Now, the process to replace this thermostat is fairly straightforward. I personally have issues with this thermostat housing and leaking. I have tried every sort of RTV and gasket maker you can think of. I've used the OEM gasket for this, and just every time it continues to leak. The best thing that I have found was that straight gasket maker, actually the Right Stuff, and it's called the Right Stuff. They have 1 minute and 90-minute gasket maker for that. It has worked the best so far without a paper gasket, just the Right Stuff. Not only am I going to be replacing the thermostat, but because of my leak issues, I am going to be installing this Jegs external thermostat housing. I think this is going to give me a chance to not have to take off the housing every time I want to replace my thermostat. Hopefully that isn't too often, but it does happen to be quite often for me. So I'm going to be installing this on my upper radiator hose. Super excited to get it started. Let's get into it. I'm going to start by draining the radiator fluid out of the petcock drain valve right down at the side there, and then we'll get the hose and belt off. All right, so I've already released the petcock drain valve, and now it is starting to drain my radiator fluid. From here, we're going to start loosening our upper radiator hose clamps. At this point, I can go ahead and remove my upper radiator hose. Good to have some paper towels nearby just in case there is some residual coolant left in the hose. Shouldn't be all that much though on the upper radiator hose. All right, now that we have our upper radiator hose off and put to the side, it is time to get the belt off of the engine. On this Ford engine in particular, they made it super easy to get the belt off with the pulley tensioner. All you have to do is get a 3/8 inch ratchet, and then you just get a little leverage on that and it comes right off. Super duper easy. Once that is off, we have the clearance to get our thermostat housing bolts off. There's just 2 of them for that. Super easy. Let's get that done, and then we can pull off our housing and get the thermostat out of there. Right, now that those bolts are off, we can get our housing off. It does require a little bit of force because I did have to put a lot of gasket maker on there before. Like I said, I've just had a non-stop leaking issue, so I had to put quite a bit of gasket maker on there before. Don't want to stick a screwdriver in there or anything. I don't want to gouge up the metal and cause any issues in the future, so I just had to pull it off with a little bit of force, but there it goes. Here we have our thermostat in here. Let me get that out of there. And once we get that out, we are all good to start the reverse process. We'll get the thermostat housing cleaned up a little bit. We'll get the mating surfaces cleaned up, and then we will get the thermostat housing back onto the engine. All right, I have a super soft wire brush that I am using to clean off the mating surfaces. Not going crazy, you don't want to score the metal, just something really soft bristle. Now that I have that cleaned up, I'm going to be using the Right Stuff, and this has just been the best that I have found that works for making the thermostat housing not leak on me. Put a couple dabs around, and then I'm just going to be using my finger to spread it around and create a gasket for this housing. Now that we have that on there, let's get the thermostat housing replaced. I'm not going to torque this down first thing. I'm just going to hand tighten the bolts make sure it has a good seal, and then I will let the gasket maker cure for a couple hours. It does say ready in 90 minutes, but I always like to give it some extra time just in case. Plus, I have to go to my actual job. So I'm gonna be giving this the day to cure, and then from there, I'll come back, I'll torque down the bolts and make sure that it has a good seal. All right, it has been a few hours. I have that thermostat housing tightened up nicely. I'm going to be reinstalling my upper radiator hose, and then I'm going to start on installing the Jegs external thermostat housing. Now, here is the layout of how it is supposed to come together. We have the housing, we have the thermostat, we have a gasket that's going to be on the thermostat and help that create a great seal, and then the other end of our thermostat housing. I'm not sure exactly where I want to put it. Per the Jegs instructions, you don't want the housing to be at the highest point of your coolant system. That's because you don't want there to be any extra air bubbles in the system. For me, in the way that this is laid out, it's going to be kind of hard to put it in an area that's not the highest point. So I'm going to try to put it as close to the actual housing as possible. But to make it not the highest point is going to be a little bit difficult for me. I'll do my best to bleed out any air that's in the system so there aren't any issues. All right, so let's get this unpacked. Let's see all of the parts that we have. All right, so we have one side of our housing. This is the receiving side, so this is closer to the engine side. Next, let's see, we have our baggie full of our screws. We have our gasket that we'll be using on our thermostat to create that seal. Perfect. And now we have our other side of the housing. This side is going to be closer to our radiator. Next, we are supposed to use our gasket, and that is going to go nicely around our thermostat. Now, you guys can probably do this easier than I can. I struggled a little bit, but there is a little slit inside of the interior of the gasket, and that helps create a perfect seal around our thermostat. Once we have that, we are going to place it into our thermostat housing. All right, now that we have that in our housing, let's get the screws put in there, and we'll have everything closed up and sealed nice and tight. You'll want to note as well, the thermostat does have a weep hole on the top part of it. You'll want to position that inside the housing so that it is still on the top. That way any air can escape and the system doesn't overheat. All right, like I said before, you're going to want to note where the weep hole is so that we know where the top of the housing should be. I'm using a yellow paint pen just to mark where I see the weep hole. That way I can position that mark on top when I install the housing. All right, we are good to go. Let's start getting this radiator hose cut so we can position our housing inside of it. Let's try to see where I want to put this. There's not a lot of good places. You really want to get it on a straightaway with this so there aren't any kinks or bends that might cause any leaks. I'm going to be probably putting it as close to that original housing area as possible. Let's see. I think right here is where I'm going to be putting it. Let's get this cut. Now that that's done, let's get this fit onto our radiator hose. All right, now the kit that I got came with these clamps that fit perfectly on there. For all of you wondering, the kit number for this is 53260. I'll include this in the description below. Now that that is on there, let's get this tightened down with our clamps. I started off with a screwdriver, but it is a lot easier to use a socket, so I'm going to be changing that out for a socket. Much easier to get a nice tight seal on there. Once I have the hose clamps connected snugly to our housing, we'll get the ones tightened down to the original housing and to the upper radiator portion as well. Now that we have that done, it is time to replace our belt. I would put up a belt diagram for you guys, but seriously, everyone has their own setups. Currently, I have the smog pump still on my engine. Some people have removed it and do a smog pump delete. Some people don't have AC, or they, I don't know, maybe don't have power steering, who knows. But everyone's, I feel like, is a little bit different. So just try to remember how you had your belt on there before. Maybe take a picture. It's not super duper difficult. All right, now that we have our belt on, our hose clamps tightened down, it is time to bleed our system. We want to make sure that we get all of the air out of the system, because that will cause us overheating issues. Now, there are a couple different ways that you could bleed the system. I have a spill-free funnel that I purchased a long time ago. It has worked great since I bought it. You're just going to want to fill up the radiator with your car's coolant. I use a 50-50 mix of distilled water and coolant concentrate. You're going to want to fill that into the system until you have a little bit left on top that won't drain down into your radiator. That's how you know it's at a good level. At that point, it is time to turn on your engine. When the engine is turned on, coolant will start flowing through the system. At that point, you're going to want to let it warm up just a little bit. You're going to be squeezing all of the rubber hose lines, trying to get any air that's trapped in the system out of there. It'll come out of the top of your funnel and you'll see it bubble out of there. There we go. We can see the system's running. Time to start evacuating all of the air from the system. It helps as well to turn on your heater. That way coolant will get around to your heater core as well and help evacuate some of the air out of that system. Perfect. We'll get squeezing on these hoses. All right, everything is looking good. Once you feel like all of the air that is in there has been evacuated, you are good to turn off your engine. We'll get the funnel removed and then we'll replace our radiator cap, and at that point we will be good to go for a test drive. All right, here we are on the road. I'm going to be taking us on the freeway to try to get the engine warmed up a little faster. We have our water gauge on top here that is showing 180 and it is slowly rising. I'm going to be speeding up the video a little bit for you guys so you don't have to endure the whole ride with me. What we're really looking for is the thermostat to open. So we're going to be driving. You'll start to see the coolant level get higher and higher, and then at a certain point it's going to drop back down to the middle point, to 180, and that's how we know that our thermostat is working properly. It gets up to a higher temperature, it opens so that coolant can flow through into our radiator and start cooling the system down. All right, we've been driving for a while, we're waiting for it, and I think there it is. All right, see how that got up to a higher temperature and then thermostat opened, it dropped down to a normal temp, and now coolant is going to be going through that thermostat into the radiator to be cooled down for our engine. Fantastic. So we know the thermostat works, our housing looks great, and now we don't have to worry about leaking from our thermostat housing, hopefully, anymore. Thank you all very much for watching. Hopefully this video has given you some insight into the process if you are considering doing this to your car or truck. I'm super excited to get started with part 2 of this video, which will be actually installing the electric fan into the Ford F-150. There are a few wiring things that I'll have to do with that, but I am super excited to get started with that process. I'll see you guys then.